The cold wind bites at my skin as I sit in the RV, locked out of my own family's life on Christmas. Still, I sit there, my fingers trembling, not from the cold, but from betrayal. As the faint hum of their laughter drifts through the house, I realize this is no accident. This is deliberate. While the darkness presses in, something inside me shifts. The next morning, I sign the RV title, my grip steady, my decision final. No more will I be hidden away. This time, I take control. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Margaret pulled into the driveway, the familiar warmth of Christmas lights blinking from the eaves of Ethan's house. She had spent so many holidays here, once filled with the sounds of laughter and family games. Tonight, the glow from the windows seemed different, almost too bright, too forced. Still, she smiled to herself, shaking off the unease, and stepped out of her car. It was Christmas after all, and she wasn't about to let anything ruin her favorite holiday. The front door opened as soon as she reached the porch. Ethan stood there beaming, his arms wide for an embrace. "Merry Christmas, Mom." His tone was syrupy sweet, too much so, and his smile didn't quite meet his eyes. But she embraced him anyway, accepting the forced warmth of the gesture. Sophie appeared behind him. Her arms crossed in a way that made Margaret's hackles rise slightly. "So glad you could make it, Margaret," Sophie said, her voice smooth and almost saccharine. "I'm sure it's been a tough year for you." Margaret knew better than to bite back. "Thanks, Sophie. Merry Christmas." As they settled inside, the house was filled with the smell of roasting meat and cinnamon. The living room was bustling with distant relatives, Ethan's cousins and their children. Margaret's heart sank. It was always loud here, always busy, but tonight there was an extra layer of noise, a tension that buzzed just below the surface. She spotted the Christmas tree in the corner, adorned with gold and red ornaments, yet something about it felt off. Dinner was served promptly. The turkey, golden and perfectly roasted, sat proudly at the center of the table. Margaret tried to focus on the food, the familiar faces around her, but her son's words pierced through the air with unnerving ease. "You know, Mom, I'm surprised you're still hanging on to that old house of yours. It's practically a museum." Ethan's voice was casual, as if he were discussing the weather. Margaret tightened her grip on her fork, the words striking deeper than she'd expected. She forced a smile. "I like it. It's home." Sophie chimed in, her eyes gleaming with something sharp. "It's just a little much for someone your age, don't you think? You should think about downsizing." Margaret glanced at them both, Ethan's eyes glinting with the same faux sweetness, Sophie's lips curling in a polite, calculated smile. The same game. She took a breath, steadying herself. "I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions. Thank you." The words felt heavy in the air, but they passed her lips with a calmness she didn't feel. The evening dragged on, the surface-level pleasantries slowly cracking under the weight of thinly veiled barbs. Ethan made more offhand comments about her clothes, how dated they were. Sophie raised an eyebrow every time Margaret reached for something, as though expecting her to struggle with simple tasks. And every time they tried to push her buttons, Margaret swallowed her anger, feigning indifference. The more they pried, the more she drew within herself, knowing that there was no point in fighting back. Not here, not tonight. After the meal, as the family began to disperse and chatter took over the room, Ethan sidled up to her with that same false charm. "You know, Mom, there's really no room for you in here with everyone. We've got some old friends of ours dropping by, and the kids are, well, you know how they are." Margaret raised an eyebrow, a flicker of suspicion lighting in her chest. "What are you suggesting?" Sophie appeared at Ethan's side then, her expression sweet but tight, like she was trying to sell a poorly executed lie. "It's just that, well, We've got the RV in the driveway, and it might be a bit more peaceful for you to stay out there tonight, away from the chaos inside. Margaret's stomach turned. The RV. The one they had always acted so dismissive of. It was parked at the edge of their driveway, a tired relic. But it was hers. She had spent countless hours there when Ethan and Sophie hadn't been around. She had put her own stamp on it. It had been her sanctuary. But now they were suggesting she sleep there like an afterthought. Out of sight. Out of mind. Are you asking me to leave? Margaret's voice was steady, but her pulse quickened. Well, not leave exactly, Ethan said quickly, though his smile had thinned. It's just, it'll be more comfortable for you. You wouldn't want to be in the way, right? Sophie leaned in, her voice a little too smooth. It's only for the night, Margaret. You'll be just fine. Think of it as an adventure. Margaret stood frozen, her mind racing. She didn't need this. Not today. Not on Christmas. Yet here they were, treating her like an outsider in her own family, as if she were a burden they could no longer be bothered with. With a final, sharp exhale, she nodded. Fine, I'll stay in the RV. As she walked toward the door, she heard Ethan's laugh ring out behind her and Sophie's low murmur of approval. It was all so calculated. Margaret stepped out onto the porch, her breath coming out in thin puffs of cold air, and she headed for the RV. When she reached the door, she noticed something strange, something that hadn't been there before. The door was locked. She reached for the handle, confused, her fingers numbing from the cold. What the hell? She knocked. No response. Ethan? Sophie? Her voice broke through the silence. No answer. A chill ran down her spine as she realized, with creeping dread, that she wasn't meant to be there, in the RV, on her own terms. They had planned this, left her outside, isolated, as if she didn't matter at all. She rattled the door again, harder now, but it was no use. She was trapped. The world she had known, the family she had raised, had turned on her in the most brutal, humiliating way. Margaret stood there, her hands trembling as she stared at the locked door. This wasn't just a mistake, she thought. This was a betrayal. The cold seeped through her clothes, the sting of isolation sinking deeper than the winter air. And in that moment, she knew. This was just the beginning. The wind howled outside the RV, rattling the thin walls, but inside, it was still. Eerily still. Margaret sat on the edge of the worn sofa, her hands trembling as they gripped the edges of her coat. The small, dimly lit space felt suffocating, the stale air thick with the scent of old leather and dust. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the locked door. The frost on the windows blurred the world outside, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the sting of betrayal, sharper than any chill the night could bring. She had been here before, in this RV, but never like this. It had always been her sanctuary, her escape. After her husband passed, it was the only place where she could be alone with her thoughts, away from the demands of the world. She had fixed it up herself. New curtains, fresh cushions, a few personal touches here and there. But tonight, it felt like a cage. The small, cramped space that had once been a retreat now seemed like a prison. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, her breath coming out in ragged gasps. She could still hear the echoes of Ethan's voice, the laughter that followed, Sophie's sickly sweet tone cutting through the air. It'll be more comfortable for you. A lie, she now realized. Comfortable. Was that how they saw her? Just something to put away when they had no use for her? Her mind raced as she thought back to the years of manipulation, the subtle ways they had chipped away at her independence, at her sense of worth. Ethan had always been the golden boy, the son who could do no wrong. Sophie, with her practiced sweetness, had always known how to get what she wanted, how to make Margaret feel small without ever saying a word. And now, this, this humiliation. Locked in the RV like an unwanted guest, the silence of the night stretched out, pressing down on her. She had always been strong, but tonight, she felt broken. How did I let this happen? She had given them everything, her time, her love, her support. And in return, they had treated her like an inconvenience. She wasn't their mother anymore. She wasn't their family. She was just an old woman, something to be hidden away when the new, shiny things came into their lives. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. But she wouldn't let them fall. Not here. Not like this. The hours passed slowly, the cold creeping in through every crack. She could hear the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses from inside the house, their merry voices floating through the thin walls. She closed her eyes, but the image of their smug faces, their calculated smiles, was seared into her mind. I won't let them do this to me anymore. It wasn't just tonight. It was every little thing they had done to her over the years. The way they constantly undermined her, made her feel like she was losing touch, like she was becoming irrelevant. Every time she tried to stand up for herself, they would smother her with kindness, with guilt, with that damn sweetness that made her second-guess her own instincts. No more. Margaret's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had spent too many years letting them control her, letting them take from her. The house, the money, the endless favors. She had given it all without question, but no more. She wouldn't be their doormat. She would not be silenced, locked away like some inconvenient relic of the past. Her breath came in a sharp gasp as the thought struck her like lightning. I'll fight back. She had something they didn't expect, something they would never understand. The RV, the one they thought was just a dusty old vehicle, a place to stick her out of sight, was her weapon now. It was her key to freedom. She could drive away, leave them all behind, escape the suffocating grip of their expectations. It was hers, and they couldn't take it from her. Not now. The thought of seeing them, Ethan and Sophie, again made her stomach twist. She would make them regret what they had done. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. She would make sure they saw the strength she had buried for far too long. She would not be their victim any longer. The next morning, the light from the rising sun filtered through the frosted window, casting long shadows across the small space. Margaret sat up slowly, her body stiff from the cold, her mind clear with determination. She reached for her phone, her fingers moving decisively as she dialed the number she hadn't called in years, the number of her lawyer, James Carter. The line rang twice before James picked up, his voice a calm, professional tone that immediately brought a sense of reassurance. Margaret, what can I do for you? I need your help, she said, her voice steady but firm. I want to make sure that RV is legally mine, and I need to start taking back control. James paused for a moment, and then, as if sensing the weight of her words, replied, Of course, we'll take action right away. Don't worry, we'll get you the help you need. Margaret exhaled, feeling the first real sense of relief she'd had in hours. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had the upper hand. I'm not going to let them do this to me again, James, she said, her voice low but resolute. I'm taking my life back. James's voice softened, but there was a strength behind it. I'll help you, Margaret. You don't have to fight this alone. She hung up the phone, a sense of peace washing over her. She had made the first move, and it was only the beginning. Margaret stood up, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. This ends now. The morning light crept through the frost-coated window of the RV, casting long, jagged shadows across the worn upholstery. Margaret pulled herself from the bed, the remnants of a fitful sleep heavy in her bones. Her mind buzzed with purpose now, a sharp clarity cutting through the fog of the night. She had been locked away in this small, cold space. But today, she would seize control. Today, she would take back what was rightfully hers. She stepped outside, her breath visible in the icy air, and made her way toward the side of the RV. The crisp, biting wind bit at her cheeks, but it was a welcome sensation, a reminder that she was alive, that she could still fight. She bent down to retrieve the old, weathered box that sat beneath the RV's rear tires, a box filled with her memories, the items she had kept for herself after her husband's death. Inside, among photographs and dusty keepsakes, lay the one thing that would change everything: the RV title. Margaret ran her fingers over the yellowing paper, her pulse quickening as she read the words. Her name, Margaret Williams, clearly printed across the top. This was hers. She had bought this RV years ago, after Richard had passed. Her late husband, the man who had always wanted to travel, to explore the world with her. They had dreamed of taking long trips together, seeing the sights they had always talked about. But Richard's death had stolen that dream, and she had kept the RV as a reminder of those lost possibilities. It had been a symbol of what could have been. But now it was so much more. It was a symbol of her freedom, her independence. She tucked the title into her coat pocket, feeling the weight of it there, grounding her. She could hear the muffled sounds of activity from inside Ethan and Sophie's house. Distant voices, laughter, the clink of silverware. But it all felt so far away now. She had moved beyond their petty control. She had a plan, and she wasn't going to let them take this from her. Inside the RV, Margaret set the title down on the small kitchen counter. She opened the drawer and retrieved the pen she kept hidden there, just in case. The pen felt heavy in her hand, as though it were a weapon rather than a tool. She held it for a long moment, considering the next steps. She had spent so many years ceding control to others, her husband, her son, her daughter-in-law. But that was over. She would no longer be a passive player in their game. She remembered the words James had spoken to her earlier. "We'll take action right away, Margaret. You don't have to fight this alone." His voice had been calm, steady, an anchor in the chaos of her thoughts. And that was exactly what she needed now. Someone who could guide her. Someone who could make sure that the RV would stay in her hands. It wasn't just about the RV. It was about asserting her place in the world again, about reclaiming what she had lost. She picked up the title again, her eyes scanning over the words. Margaret Williams. No more excuses. She would make sure it stayed with her. But she also knew that Ethan and Sophie wouldn't just give up. They'd fight her every step of the way, especially now that she was making a stand. She would have to be strategic. Think ahead. James had suggested signing the title over to herself legally, ensuring no one could claim it once it was in her control. She scribbled down her plan, her handwriting tight and deliberate. 1. Take the RV to a safe location. 2. Have a legal claim drawn up to protect ownership. 3. Block any access Ethan or Sophie might try to gain to the vehicle. 4. Inform them of my intentions without compromise. Margaret sat back, reading the list again. It wasn't just about the RV. It was about taking back her life, her autonomy, from the people who had tried to strip it away from her. She would not allow them to control her any longer. She was done being the person who bent and yielded, the one who put everyone else's needs ahead of her own. She had given enough. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was James. Margaret. His voice was steady. I've arranged for everything. The paperwork will be in place by tomorrow morning. All you need to do is sign the title over and it will be legally yours, beyond their reach. Margaret closed her eyes, a deep breath of relief escaping her lips. Thank you, James. I won't let them take this from me. I'm done being their target. I know you are, Margaret, he replied softly. You're doing the right thing. As she hung up the phone, The weight of the decision settled deeper in her bones. She had always tried to be the good mother, the dutiful family member. But now, she was going to do what was right for her, for the first time in years. She glanced down at the title again, her fingers brushing over the inked words. Margaret Williams. Her name, standing alone, no one else to claim it but her. It was more than just a legal document, it was her declaration of independence. Outside, the wind howled again, but this time, it didn't feel like an invasion. It felt like a herald, a sign of what was to come. She was ready. The game had changed, and this time she was in control. As Margaret turned to leave, her heart raced with the thrill of what lay ahead. But then, a thought struck her. A cold, sharp realization. What if they try to fight back? Ethan and Sophie wouldn't just let her go. They would come for her. Come for the RV. Come for everything she had worked to protect. But it was too late for that. She had made her move. And now, there was no going back. Margaret stood on the edge of the RV, the cold biting at her skin as she stared out into the bleak morning. The world felt quieter today. The usual hum of the city muffled behind the walls of her small sanctuary. The title, the key to her independence, was still in her hand, heavy with finality. She could almost hear Ethan's voice in her head, mocking, belittling her. The same tone he had used for years. It was time to stop letting him control her. No more, she thought, steeling herself for what was coming next. Her phone sat on the counter, a small but mighty tool that would set the course of her life in motion. With a final steadying breath, she picked it up and dialed Ethan's number. The phone rang twice, each tone echoing in her ears. She gripped the device tightly, feeling the tremor in her fingers. But she wouldn't back down. She couldn't. When Ethan's voice finally came through, it was laced with that same false cheerfulness she had come to despise. "Mom, what's going on? Everything okay?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. The fake warmth in his tone only fueled her resolve. "Ethan, we need to talk." A chuckle came from the other end. "Oh, come on, Mom. What's this about? You sound serious." "I am serious," Margaret replied, her voice steady and cold. "I'm done. The RV is mine, legally. I've taken steps to make sure no one can take it from me." There was a long pause on the line, the silence thick with disbelief. Margaret could almost picture Ethan's face, the raised eyebrows, the confused smirk. Finally, he scoffed, a laugh escaping him. "Wait, you're serious? You've really lost it this time, Mom." Margaret didn't flinch. She could feel the weight of his dismissal, but it didn't matter. She wasn't the vulnerable, easily manipulated woman she had been a year ago. "I'm not joking, Ethan. The RV belongs to me now, and you can't take it from me." Another pause, this one longer, as if Ethan was trying to figure out if she was bluffing. "You've really got to be kidding me," he said finally, his voice full of mock amusement. "You can't be serious. It's just a stupid RV. Why make this such a big deal?" Margaret's jaw tightened. She had tried for years to placate him, to smooth things over, to make everything easier. But the more she gave, the more they took. She had been a fool to let him think that her kindness was a weakness. "It's not just about the RV, Ethan. It's about respect. Something you and Sophie seem to have forgotten. I won't let you treat me like this anymore." There was a sharp, irritated sigh from Ethan. "Oh, so now you're going to lecture me on respect? You've been treating me like a kid my whole life. And now, all of a sudden, you want to be the big shot? This is ridiculous, Mom." Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. Ridiculous? She had spent years letting him walk all over her, letting him use her for his own gain. And now, just when she was finally standing up for herself, he was calling her ridiculous. "I'm not asking for your approval, Ethan," she said, her voice firm. "This is happening. And you need to understand that the RV is mine. Not yours. Not Sophie's. It's mine. Ethan was silent for a beat, and then he spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. Okay, fine. But listen to me, Mom. This is all a big overreaction. Why don't we sit down, talk about it, and figure something out? We can come to an agreement, right? Margaret's pulse quickened as the realization hit her. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't asking for understanding. He was trying to manipulate her again, trying to turn the tables in his favor, just like always. Not this time. No, Ethan, she said, her tone icy. There is nothing to figure out. You've had your chance to control me, to walk all over me, and I've had enough. I'm done being manipulated by you and Sophie. His voice shot back, defensive now, with that familiar sense of entitlement. You don't get it, do you? You're being selfish. You think you can just take everything from us, after all we've done for you? You're acting like we've never cared about you. Stop. Margaret's voice cut through his words like a blade. This isn't about you and Sophie. This is about me finally standing up for myself. I won't let you guilt trip me anymore. The RV is mine, and you won't touch it. There was a long silence. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for his response, feeling a surge of power that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Finally, Ethan's voice came, quieter now, but still tinged with anger. You're making a mistake, Mom. But fine. If you want to play this game, I'll play along. Just don't expect me to forget this. Margaret's lips tightened, but she didn't respond. She didn't need to. The conversation was over. She hung up the phone, the silence in the RV settling around her like a heavy blanket. She stared at the device in her hand, her mind racing with the weight of the decision. Ethan wouldn't give up. Sophie wouldn't either. They would fight her for what she had now claimed, and they would stop at nothing to get what they thought was theirs. But Margaret wasn't afraid anymore. She had made her stand. And this was only the beginning. The day after the call to Ethan, Margaret sat in the corner of her small kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear, listening to the steady voice of James on the other end. Her fingers tapped nervously against the counter, the rhythm of her own pulse echoing in her head. This wasn't just about an RV anymore. It was about taking back control. Her life had been on autopilot for too long, and she wasn't about to let Ethan and Sophie turn her into a spectator in her own story. We'll act fast, Margaret, James said, his voice smooth but purposeful. I've got the paperwork ready. We'll file a legal claim that ensures your ownership of the RV is unassailable. You'll be the one holding the keys, legally and literally. But we need to make sure everything's airtight. We can't leave anything to chance. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the room, seeing it all through a new lens. Every piece of furniture, every knick-knack, felt like a symbol of a life she'd been too afraid to fully claim. She had let her family, especially Ethan, push her around for years. But that was over. Now, she needed to safeguard everything that was hers and make sure no one, not even her son, could steal it from her again. Okay, James, she said, her voice firmer than she'd expected. Let's do it. The next few days passed in a blur of legal forms, documents, and phone calls. James had arranged for a legal strategy that would keep Ethan and Sophie from making any claim on the RV. Margaret wasn't just defending the RV, she was protecting her autonomy, her ability to stand on her own. She wasn't going to let them drown her in their manipulation. Not anymore. She went over the plan with James again, making sure she understood every detail. Once the paperwork was filed, the RV would be legally safe from Ethan's grasp. But there were other things she needed to do to make sure the control she was gaining wouldn't slip away. The deeper she dug into her financials, the more she realized how much power Ethan and Sophie had over her. They'd always treated her like an ATM. never truly seeing her as anything more than a source of money. But Margaret wasn't blind anymore. She had to sever every link that tied her to their grasp. Later that day, Margaret sat at her desk, her fingers moving over the keyboard as she changed the passwords to all her accounts. She'd been careful before, but now there were no more half measures. Every account was locked down tight, and she'd made sure there was a digital trail in case anyone tried to tamper with her assets. She'd set up secure layers of protection, ones that Ethan wouldn't be able to worm his way through with his charm or his pressure tactics. The sense of power that filled her as she secured each password felt intoxicating, like a weight was lifting off her chest. She was finally taking back what had been stolen from her piece by piece, and she wasn't going to stop until everything was in her control. After hours of poring over her accounts, Margaret moved to the next phase of her plan: the RV, the one thing she had left to protect. The place where she had found solace in the darkest moments of her life. It had been her refuge, a symbol of what was possible, a future she could still carve out for herself. Now, it was time to make sure it stayed in her hands, where it belonged. Margaret hadn't told anyone about the secret arrangement she'd made. Ethan and Sophie wouldn't know where the RV was until it was too late. She had made a quiet call to a trusted friend in the storage business, someone who could discreetly take the RV and keep it under lock and key. The plan was simple. She'd get the RV out of the driveway, out of Ethan's reach, and move it to a private facility where no one could touch it. She had already packed a small bag of essentials to go with it, just in case she needed to make a quick getaway. It wasn't about running away, it was about control. She needed to take back the narrative. When the night came, Margaret's heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and dread. She wasn't afraid of what she was doing. She was afraid of what it meant. This was the moment everything would change, and once it did, there would be no going back. She drove the RV slowly, carefully, her eyes darting in the rearview mirror to make sure no one was following. The storage facility was only a few miles away, but it felt like a lifetime. Every turn she made, every mile that passed, she felt a strange sense of exhilaration. It was as if she were shedding her old skin, leaving behind the version of herself that had been easy to control, easy to ignore. When she finally pulled into the lot, Margaret breathed a sigh of relief. The storage facility was secure, tucked away behind a high fence, a place where no one would come looking. She parked the RV in the back, next to a row of other vehicles that looked equally forgotten. The space was silent, and for the first time in days, Margaret felt a sense of peace. The RV was safe. She was safe. But as she stood in the parking lot, staring at the vehicle she had worked so hard to protect, a cold thought crossed her mind. What if they find out? What if Ethan comes looking? Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't over yet. She had made the first move. But the war was far from won. The quiet buzz of the phone was the only sound in Margaret's home as she paced, her hand gripped around it tightly, ready to make the call that would change everything. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, a rapid rhythm that echoed the intensity of the last few days. Every decision she had made had led to this moment, standing up for herself, confronting Ethan and Sophie, and finally asserting her authority. It wasn't about the RV anymore. It was about her, her dignity, her autonomy, her right to be treated with respect. She wasn't going to be their puppet anymore. Taking a steadying breath, Margaret dialed Ethan's number. The phone rang once, twice, and then he picked up. "Hey, Mom, what's going on?" Ethan's voice was casual, too casual, and yet there was an edge to it, a flicker of suspicion he hadn't been able to suppress. "I need to talk to you and Sophie," Margaret said, her voice clear, unwavering. "Now." There was a slight pause on the other end. Sure, Mom. We're just finishing up some things, but we can come over. What's this about?" Margaret's eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. She had a plan, and she wasn't about to let them control the narrative. She wasn't asking for their approval anymore. "I'll be at your place in 20 minutes. Without waiting for a response, she hung up. She didn't need their permission to stand her ground anymore. Her heart still raced, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from anticipation. She had made up her mind, and she wasn't backing down. When Margaret arrived at Ethan's house, it looked the same as always. Cheerful lights flickered in the windows, and the faint hum of music spilled out from inside. But she wasn't fooled. Behind those walls, things were different. She was different. Sophie greeted her first, the smile on her face thin, almost mocking. "Well, look who decided to show up. What's the crisis this time, Margaret?" Margaret stepped inside, not waiting for an invitation. "No crisis. I came here to make something very clear." Ethan appeared from the kitchen, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. He gave her a practiced smile. "You're still upset about the RV, huh? Come on, Mom, it's just a thing. Let's talk about this rationally. You don't need to make a big deal out of it." Margaret's lips tightened. "I'm not here to talk rationally, Ethan. I'm here to tell you that the RV is mine, legally. You have no right to it, and I'm not giving it up." Sophie scoffed from the side, her arms folded in a defensive posture. "Really, Margaret? You're acting like this is some grand betrayal. It's just an old RV. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. You're just throwing a tantrum because things aren't going your way." Margaret's gaze never wavered from her son. "This isn't a tantrum, Sophie. This is me finally standing up for myself." Her voice grew colder, more cutting. "For years, I've tolerated your disrespect, your manipulation. And I've done it quietly, thinking it was what a mother was supposed to do. But not anymore. I won't be bullied. I won't be treated like a fool any longer." Ethan's face twisted with frustration, his mouth opening to say something, but Margaret held up a hand. She wasn't finished. "No, Ethan. You listen now. I've had enough of your games. I've had enough of you acting like you can control me, like I don't matter. The RV isn't just a piece of property. It's a symbol of my freedom. Something I've worked for. Something that's mine. I've been too quiet for too long. You don't get to push me around anymore." Sophie let out a bitter laugh, taking a step toward Margaret. "Oh, please, Margaret. You're not in control of anything. You think you can scare us with your little speeches? You think you can just throw around legal jargon and expect us to back off? You've lost your mind." Ethan glared at Margaret, his frustration turning to anger. "You're being unreasonable, Mom. You're too old to be making decisions like this. You don't know what you're doing. You're making a huge mistake." Margaret felt a flush of heat rise in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "No, Ethan. You're the one who's been making mistakes, not me. You've treated me like an ATM, like a burden to be disposed of when you're done with me. But I've learned my lesson. I'm not your punching bag anymore. The RV stays with me, and you can't change that." Ethan's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he said nothing. Sophie, however, seemed to lose her patience, stepping closer, her eyes burning with a dangerous intensity. "You think you've won, don't you? This is just one more thing you've stolen from us. You'll see, Margaret. You can't get away with this. We'll make you regret it." Margaret met Sophie's gaze, unblinking. She wasn't afraid of them anymore. "Go ahead and try, Sophie. You won't scare me. I'm done being your punching bag. I'm done with both of you." The tension in the room was palpable, thick as the silence that followed her words. Ethan stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. But Margaret stood tall, steady, her eyes locked onto his. The battle lines had been drawn. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into, Mom," Ethan muttered, his voice low, dangerous. Margaret didn't flinch. "I think I do." As she turned to leave, she felt the weight of their stares follow her, a heavy reminder that this fight was far from over. But this time, Margaret wasn't backing down. Not for anyone. Not anymore. The courtroom was cold, its sterile white walls a far cry from the warmth of Margaret's home. But it felt fitting. This battle for control needed to be fought in a place that was impartial. A place where the rules of the game were clear. She could feel the weight of the room as she stepped inside, her lawyer, James, by her side. He gave her a brief nod, his professional demeanor a reminder that she wasn't alone in this. She looked across the room, her eyes meeting Ethan and Sophie's. Ethan stood stiffly, his face flushed with a mixture of frustration and resentment, while Sophie, ever the picture of calculated composure, stood next to him, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The tension in the room was already thick, and they hadn't even begun. Margaret sat down with a quiet grace, feeling the energy of the room shift around her. The stakes were high, but for the first time in a long time, she felt centered, focused. This wasn't about the RV anymore. It was about reclaiming her life, about showing Ethan and Sophie that she wasn't a victim anymore, that she had something they could never take away from her. Her strength. The judge, a stern man with sharp features, called the proceedings to order. His voice echoed through the room, demanding attention. This is a case regarding the ownership of a recreational vehicle, the RV in question being registered under the name of Margaret Williams, the judge said, looking at both sides of the room. Mr. and Mrs. Williams, you claim that your mother has wrongfully taken possession of the RV. Ms. Williams, you state that the RV is legally yours, purchased and maintained with your own funds. Is that correct? Margaret nodded, her heart steady. Yes, Your Honor. The tension shifted again, the air thick with anticipation. Ethan and Sophie were up first. Ethan's voice was sharp as he addressed the judge, trying to mask his anger with a practiced calm. We're not here to make this personal, Ethan said, glancing briefly at Margaret, though his gaze quickly shifted away. But the reality is that my mother is making an unreasonable decision. The RV was never really just hers. It was part of the family's assets, part of the house, and in the context of our family, it should have been treated as shared property. We've done a lot for her over the years, and this is just one more thing she's decided to take for herself, without considering the impact it has on anyone else. Sophie jumped in, her voice smooth and silky, though it held an undercurrent of frustration. This is about fairness, Your Honor. Margaret has always been treated with kindness, with respect, and now, she's throwing it all away. We only want what's rightfully ours. It's just an RV, after all. Why make this into something it's not? Margaret's fingers tightened on the armrest as Sophie spoke, the mockery in her tone cutting deeper than Margaret had expected. But she remained calm, letting the words wash over her, refusing to let them affect her. She was in control now. When it was Margaret's turn, James stood up next to her, his calm, reassuring presence a rock in the storm. He began by addressing the judge, his voice clear and authoritative. Your Honor, this is a straightforward case. The RV in question was purchased by Margaret Williams after her husband passed. She paid for it with her own funds, and it has never been considered part of any joint property. All documentation regarding its purchase, including the original bill of sale and the registration, are in her name. The RV is legally hers, and she has every right to keep it as she sees fit. The judge nodded, glancing down at the papers James had handed him. And this is substantiated by the documents presented? Yes, Your Honor, James replied, pulling out a stack of paperwork. We have full proof of purchase, including bank statements showing that the RV was bought solely by Ms. Williams. We also have clear evidence that it has never been part of any shared property agreement with her son or daughter-in-law. As James laid out the evidence, Margaret could feel the tension rising. She watched as Sophie and Ethan exchanged frustrated glances. They hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her to be prepared, and it showed. Their carefully crafted narrative of Margaret being an erratic, selfish mother was beginning to unravel in front of them. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Sophie before speaking again, his voice rising in frustration. But, Your Honor, the RV is more than just a car. It's part of our family's history, part of our shared lives together. It wasn't just her decision, it affects all of us. Sophie added quickly, her words laced with a final attempt at manipulation. We've taken care of her, we've supported her, we've made sacrifices to help her, and now she's taking everything for herself. This isn't fair. Margaret remained silent, but inside, a small spark of triumph flickered. The room was beginning to see them for what they truly were. Their desperation was showing, their attempts to control her life unraveling under the weight of the truth. The judge, who had been listening intently, looked down at the papers in front of him. He didn't seem swayed by their arguments, and Margaret couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. This was going in her favor. For the first time in years, things were going her way. As the judge prepared to deliberate, Margaret felt the weight of the moment settle in. She had stood up for herself, she had fought for what was hers, and she wasn't about to back down now. The courtroom was silent as the judge looked up, his expression unreadable. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as he cleared his throat, ready to speak. The next few moments would decide everything. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating as the judge took a long moment to review the documents before him. Margaret's hands clenched at her sides, but she forced herself to remain still. The weight of the case, of the years she had spent being controlled and manipulated, pressed down on her like a heavy, suffocating cloak. But today, it was all coming to a head. She could feel Ethan and Sophie's eyes burning into her from across the room, their faces twisted with frustration. They knew the game wasn't going the way they had planned. Sophie's gaze was sharp, her lips tight with anger, while Ethan stood rigid, his jaw clenched. They were losing, and they knew it. The judge's voice cut through the tension, low and steady, as he finally spoke. After considering all of the evidence presented in this case, it is clear that the RV was purchased solely by Margaret Williams, with no shared ownership or agreement regarding its possession. All documents and records support this. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of Margaret Williams. The RV is legally hers, and no further claims will be entertained. The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze around Margaret. She had won. It wasn't just about the RV anymore. It was about her life, her rights, her ability to finally stand up and say no to the people who had tried to take everything from her. A surge of relief flooded through her chest, followed by a deep, quiet pride. She had done it. She had fought. And she had won. Ethan's face drained of color, his lips pulling into a thin line as he looked at the judge, then back at Margaret. There was no denying it now. He couldn't argue against the facts. The RV was hers, and nothing would change that. Sophie's expression, on the other hand, twisted into something far more dangerous. Rage, raw and unfiltered. She shot a glance at Ethan, and Margaret could see the gears turning in her mind, already plotting her next move. "This isn't over," Ethan muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible, though Margaret could feel the threat beneath his words. He turned toward her, his eyes cold. "We can still figure this out, Mom. Let's not make this any harder than it needs to be. You don't have to be so rigid about it. We're family." Margaret's heart clenched at the word family, but she didn't falter. She had heard those same empty words too many times. She had allowed them to manipulate her, to guilt her, for far too long. Not anymore. This wasn't about what they wanted. This was about what she needed. "No," Margaret said, her voice steady but firm, the finality in her tone like the snap of a door locking shut. "This is not a negotiation. The RV is mine. I'm not going to change my mind, Ethan." Sophie, standing stiffly beside him, let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You're unbelievable, Margaret. You're really just going to throw all of this away, aren't you? Everything we've done for you, everything we've sacrificed, gone, just like that. You think you've won, but you haven't. You've lost, and you'll see that soon enough." Her words were laced with venom, but Margaret didn't flinch. She was done being their target, their scapegoat. Sophie's manipulations no longer had power over her. "I'm not losing anything, Sophie," Margaret said, her voice cold as steel. "You and Ethan don't get to control me anymore. This is my life, and I'm taking it back." Sophie's eyes blazed with fury, and for a moment, Margaret saw the woman's true colors, bitter, entitled, and incapable of seeing beyond her own selfish desires. But Margaret was no longer afraid of her. She wasn't afraid of either of them anymore. The judge's voice interrupted the tense standoff, his tone final. "I have rendered my decision. This case is closed. No further claims will be entertained. I suggest you all move on." The gavel fell, the sharp sound echoing through the room, sealing the verdict. Margaret could feel the weight of the judge's words settle around her like a cloak of certainty. It was done. Ethan and Sophie exchanged one last seething glance before turning and walking out of the courtroom, their heads held high but their bodies stiff with anger. They hadn't won. They had lost, and they knew it. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret stood alone for a moment, breathing in the air of victory. The fight was over, and for the first time in a long while, she felt free. She wasn't the woman they had tried to make her. She wasn't the scared, uncertain mother. She was Margaret Williams, and she was standing tall. The weight of their expectations, of their control, had been lifted, and in its place, there was only the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had fought for her freedom and won. The RV was hers. But more than that, Margaret realized, her life was finally her own. In the days following the courtroom victory, Margaret found herself caught in a strange limbo. The battle was over, but the echoes of it reverberated through her life. Ethan and Sophie were furious, but their tactics had shifted. They were no longer sitting quietly in the background, simmering in resentment. They were taking their fight elsewhere, spreading rumors, feeding the family with their version of the truth. Margaret had seen it coming. It wasn't enough for them to lose in court. They needed to salvage their pride, and if that meant poisoning the minds of her relatives, so be it. One evening, as Margaret sat in her living room sipping tea, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She picked it up, expecting an update from her lawyer, but instead, it was a message from her sister-in-law, Linda. "Did you hear what Ethan and Sophie are saying? They're telling everyone you've been manipulative and cruel, saying you're hoarding everything for yourself, even accusing you of being a bad mother." Margaret felt a jolt of anger but quickly masked it with a deep breath. She had expected this. Sophie, in particular, had a knack for twisting the narrative, playing the victim when things didn't go her way. The weight of the lies hung heavy, but Margaret refused to let it shake her. She wasn't the woman they thought she was, and soon, no one else would believe it either. The next day, Linda reached out again. "Some of the family wants to talk to you. They're not sure who to believe with everything being said. They think Sophie might be right about you, but I know that's not true. You've got to show them the truth." Margaret set down her tea, her fingers trembling with the realization that the seeds of doubt had been planted. But she wasn't going to fight fire with fire, not like they wanted. She was done playing their game. Instead, she turned to the one thing they hadn't anticipated: the truth. It wasn't long before Margaret received a call from James, her lawyer. "Margaret, I've seen what's happening. Sophie's social media posts are all over the place. They're accusing you of being a terrible mother, manipulating your son, and hoarding everything. We need to act fast. Margaret listened, her mind already working, already planning. What can we do? I've already drafted a response, James said, his voice calm. We'll issue a public statement, and I'll ensure it gets to the right people. We'll make it clear that Sophie's claims are not only false, but defamatory. We'll let the family know exactly what's been going on behind closed doors. Margaret's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Sophie and Ethan had used their influence over the family to paint a picture of Margaret that wasn't even close to the truth, but now she was going to turn it all around. The following week, James's response was sent to the family, carefully crafted to expose Sophie's lies without sounding defensive. The statement outlined the facts of the RV purchase, the court case, and Margaret's long history of being manipulated by her son and daughter-in-law. It was dignified, calm, and above all, truthful. And it worked. One by one, family members started reaching out to Margaret, offering support. Linda was the first to call. I knew there was more to the story. I'm so sorry for not standing by you sooner. I was just confused. Margaret smiled softly. It's okay, Linda. I know this was hard for you. The truth, it seemed, was a force that couldn't be ignored for long. The whispers of doubt that Ethan and Sophie had spread began to fade, replaced by a quiet but growing sense of support for Margaret. Her family saw the lengths to which Ethan and Sophie had gone to manipulate them, and it made them question everything. Sophie, however, wasn't backing down. She continued to post on social media, calling Margaret every name in the book, accusing her of destroying the family. But her posts began to lose their power. The more she lashed out, the more ridiculous she seemed. Even Ethan's angry phone calls to Margaret fell flat. He had nothing left to argue with. He couldn't change the facts, and his attempts to manipulate her only made him look petty and vindictive. Margaret, for her part, simply stopped engaging. She blocked Sophie's social media accounts, ignored Ethan's calls, and moved forward with her life. The weight of their manipulation no longer had any hold on her. It was as if they had lost their power the moment she decided to stop letting them control her. She spent her days doing what she loved, gardening, spending time with old friends, and finally taking the road trips she had always dreamed of. In the RV that was still hers. It felt like a quiet victory every time she turned the key in the ignition, heading down a new path, a new adventure. But more than that, it was freedom. Real freedom. As she stood by the RV one bright morning looking out over the open road, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. The fight was behind her, and she had won. Not just the RV, but her life. In the distance, she could hear the faint rumble of a car approaching. She turned, expecting nothing more than a passing moment in time. But as the car drew closer, she knew. This was just the beginning of the rest of her life. No longer controlled by their expectations, no longer shackled by their demands, Margaret was free to live her life exactly the way she wanted. And that, she realized, was more powerful than any victory she could have ever imagined. The days following the courtroom battle were filled with a quiet peace Margaret had never known. The weight of Ethan and Sophie's expectations had been lifted from her shoulders, and for the first time in years, she could breathe without feeling the pressure of their manipulation. The constant hum of anxiety had quieted. The only noise now was the soft rustling of the leaves outside her window and the occasional hum of the kettle as she made her morning tea. She had always dreamed of freedom, of waking up without the weight of their demands. Now, as the sun streamed through her kitchen window, it felt as though she had finally claimed it. The RV, once a symbol of their control, now stood proudly in her driveway, ready to carry her wherever she wanted to go. Margaret smiled as she sipped her tea, watching the birds flutter in the yard. The tension that once knotted in her chest was gone, replaced by an expansive calm. She was no longer bound by anyone's expectations, no longer tethered to a life she hadn't chosen for herself. The future was wide open, waiting for her to step into it. She had always wanted to travel, to see the places she'd only read about in books or seen on postcards. But every time she thought about it, there was something pulling her back. The constant need to cater to Ethan and Sophie's desires, their demands for attention, their pressure for more money, more time, more effort from her. They had drained her in ways she hadn't fully realized until now. But no more. Margaret stood up from the table, her heart stirring with a fresh sense of purpose. She went outside, her gaze falling on the RV. It was a bit worn, but there was something comforting about it. It had been her escape when the world felt too heavy, her little haven when she needed a break. Now it was more than that. It was a new beginning. She ran her fingers over the weathered surface, inspecting it for any repairs that needed to be made. A little patching here, a new coat of paint there. It wasn't much, but Margaret was determined to make it hers in every way. As she worked, the hours slipped by unnoticed. She found herself lost in the simple joy of creating, of transforming the RV into the place she had always dreamed of. The engine hummed smoothly when she tested it, and the interior, though modest, began to feel more like home with each adjustment. By the time she was done, the RV looked new again, bright, refreshed, and ready for adventure. The next morning, Margaret packed a small bag of essentials, tossing in her favorite books, a journal, and a few snacks. She started the engine, the familiar roar of it bringing a smile to her face. It felt like freedom, the kind she had imagined all those years ago when she and Richard had talked about their dream trips. It felt like reclaiming a piece of herself, one she had buried for too long. Margaret pulled out of the driveway, the road ahead open and inviting. There was no set destination. There didn't need to be. She was simply going where the road took her, with no one to answer to but herself. The wind rushed through the open window, and for a moment, Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. She drove for hours, her mind wandering freely. No deadlines, no demands. She felt the weight of the past fall away, piece by piece. The endless cycle of guilt and expectation that had once defined her life no longer had a grip on her. She was free. As she neared the outskirts of a small town, Margaret decided to pull over. She'd always wanted to visit old friends she hadn't seen in years. She parked near a quaint cafe and called ahead. The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, warm. "Margaret, it's been too long. Where are you?" "I'm in town," Margaret replied with a smile, her voice full of the excitement she hadn't realized she'd been missing. "I'm here for a visit." Within minutes, she was sitting in a cozy cafe, catching up with her old friend, Linda. The conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and shared memories. It felt like a piece of her old self was returning, the part that had been lost in the years of playing a role for others. Margaret listened to Linda's stories, each one bringing her closer to the person she had once been. Before Ethan, before Sophie, before all the years of manipulation and guilt. She spent a few days in the town, reconnecting with friends and visiting familiar spots, all while savoring the simplicity of it all. She felt unburdened, like the weight of the world had been lifted off her shoulders. Each day was a gift, an exploration of who she was beyond the labels others had placed on her. The more time she spent in her own company, the more she realized just how much she had given up for the sake of family obligations. By the time she left the town, Margaret felt a quiet sense of renewal. The open road was calling her again, and she was ready to answer. She didn't know where she'd go next, maybe the mountains, or perhaps along the coast. Wherever she went, Margaret knew it didn't matter. The journey itself was the point. She was no longer searching for approval, no longer bound by expectations. The RV, once a symbol of confinement, had become the vehicle of her freedom. And as she drove further down the highway, Margaret's heart swelled with the excitement of the adventures still to come. This was her time, and she was finally living it. She didn't need anyone's approval. Not anymore. Months passed, and Margaret's life continued to unfold in ways she had never imagined. The freedom she had found on the road had transformed her, reshaping her not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. As the days blended into one another, each mile traveled, each new place discovered, Margaret found herself thinking more about what she could give to the world, not just what she could take from it. Her connection to herself had deepened in ways she hadn't anticipated. The solitude, the space to think, to breathe, had allowed her to reflect on her own strength. She had spent so many years trying to please others, to meet their expectations, that she had nearly forgotten what it meant to live for herself. But now, she was living. Really living. She had always felt an unspoken pull toward helping others, especially women who had struggled with their own forms of manipulation and control. Margaret had seen enough, been through enough, to recognize the signs, the slow erosion of one's sense of self, the subtle ways people, like Ethan and Sophie, could tear someone down under the guise of helping. One quiet afternoon, as Margaret sat outside the RV in a picturesque valley surrounded by mountains, an idea came to her like a whisper on the wind. She had spent her life thinking she was alone in her suffering, but now, with the peace she had finally found, she realized how many women were out there, just like her. Women who needed to reclaim their voices, their power, and their independence. The idea began to take shape over the next few weeks. Margaret would use the RV as more than just her sanctuary. It would become a vehicle for change. She would host small workshops and retreats for women, teaching them how to break free from toxic relationships, how to rediscover their strength, and how to build lives they were proud of. The RV became a symbol of that freedom, a rolling haven for empowerment and support. Margaret started traveling to communities across the country, setting up workshops in parks, campgrounds, and small local venues. The women who attended were hesitant at first, unsure if they could truly change, if they could find their own power. But Margaret, through her calm strength and genuine empathy, slowly began to guide them toward a new way of thinking. She shared her story, but more importantly, she shared the tools they could use to build their own path forward. She saw them, those women, silent, broken, but with a flicker of hope in their eyes. Each day, as they left her retreats, there was a quiet change in them. They carried a spark, a newfound sense of self-worth. And Margaret, in turn, felt her own strength grow, each woman she helped adding a layer to the woman she had become. As the months wore on, her work began to gain recognition. People in the communities she visited saw the transformation happening before their eyes. Local organizations reached out to Margaret, inviting her to collaborate on larger projects. She became a beacon of resilience and empowerment, a living testament to the power of standing up for oneself, of choosing one's own path. Ethan and Sophie, once a constant source of frustration and worry, began to fade into the background. Margaret knew they were still out there, probably still trying to manipulate the situation in their favor. But it didn't matter anymore. She didn't need them in her life, and her newfound peace was a force far stronger than any of their petty attempts to disrupt it. Her growing influence reached beyond just the local communities. Margaret was invited to speak at conferences, to share her journey of resilience and independence. She began writing a book, telling her story in the hope that it would reach even more women, those who had not yet found the courage to stand up for themselves. With each new achievement, Margaret's legacy began to take shape. It wasn't about the RV or the retreats. It was about the lives she touched, the women who had been empowered to reclaim their own strength, to live their truth. Margaret had become a symbol of what was possible after the storm, the calm that followed. One day, as she stood in front of a large audience at a women's empowerment conference, Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of pride. She had built something lasting, something that would ripple through generations. She had gone from being controlled, hidden away, to standing at the forefront of change. She had done it on her terms, without needing anyone's approval, without bending to anyone's will. The applause echoed in her ears, but it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the realization that she had created something meaningful, something that would live on long after she was gone. As she drove the RV to her next destination, the familiar hum of the engine beneath her, Margaret smiled. She had built a legacy of resilience, one that would continue to inspire, empower, and transform the lives of women for years to come. And in that moment, she knew she had finally created the life she had always dreamed of, a life that was hers and hers alone. There was no more looking over her shoulder, no more wondering if she was doing the right thing. Margaret had found her place in the world, and it was exactly where she was meant to be. The months that followed Margaret's growing influence in the world of women's empowerment felt like a blur of travel, speaking engagements, and deep conversations. She had built a life, but more importantly, she had built a purpose. It was no longer about the RV or the victories over Ethan and Sophie. It was about the women she met along the way, women who had been through their own battles, who had struggled to find their voices in worlds that tried to silence them. Margaret began mentoring women who had faced the same struggles she once had, those who had spent years living in the shadows of others' expectations. She didn't have all the answers, but she had a gift, the ability to listen, to offer a perspective from someone who had been there, someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be made to feel small, invisible, and powerless. Each woman she mentored had a unique story, but the underlying theme was the same. Each had been forced into a life they didn't want, silenced by fear or guilt. Margaret shared her story with them, not as a means of boasting, but as a way to say, "If I can do it, so can you." She helped them break free, piece by piece, until they began to see the truth of their own worth. But it wasn't just about telling them they were worthy. It was about teaching them how to stand tall in their own lives, how to make their voices heard in the world. Margaret didn't just give advice, she showed them how to live it. She helped them discover the strength they never knew they had. While Margaret thrived in her new calling, Ethan and Sophie lingered in the background, unable to break free of their own struggles. They had tried to reconnect with her, of course. After all, family was important, wasn't it? The first time Ethan called her after the court case, his voice was shaky, almost apologetic. He'd never liked feeling vulnerable, but Margaret had changed the dynamics between them, and he didn't know how to cope with that. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about everything," Ethan said, his tone uncharacteristically quiet. "I know I messed up. Maybe I was too hard on you. I'm sorry. We need to figure this out. Your family." Margaret's response was calm, but there was a firmness to her words that made it clear she was done seeking their validation. "Ethan, I appreciate the apology, but it's not enough. I've spent years letting you manipulate me, letting you and Sophie dictate my life. I'm not going back to that." There was silence on the other end, followed by a frustrated sigh. "So that's it? You're just going to walk away from us?" "No, Ethan," Margaret said, her voice steady. "I'm walking toward me, toward the life I should have had all along." Sophie's attempts at apology came not long after, through text messages and sporadic social media posts. She used the same tactics, trying to frame herself as the victim, pleading for a second chance. But Margaret saw through the act. She had seen it too many times before, the calculated charm, the manipulation masked as kindness. One message read, I've learned my lesson, Margaret. I want to make things right. Please, let's talk. For the sake of family. Margaret didn't respond. The family they spoke of no longer existed in the way they imagined. The family she had built now consisted of the women she mentored, the people who supported her, and most importantly, herself. That was enough. Her life continued to be a testament to the lessons she had learned the hard way. Margaret taught the women she worked with that their self-worth wasn't determined by others, by a husband, a child, or anyone else who tried to take advantage of their kindness. She showed them that standing up for themselves was not selfish. It was essential. Her message spread far beyond the small workshops. As Margaret's reputation grew, so did the reach of her words. Her story appeared in publications, interviews, and even on podcasts, where she was invited to speak about her journey of independence and empowerment. More women reached out to her, asking for advice, for guidance, for the courage to break free from their own toxic situations. The best part of it all, Margaret realized, was how effortless it felt now. She no longer had to fight against the tide. She had become the tide herself, the force that pushed women to realize their own strength, their own potential. Ethan and Sophie's voices, once loud and oppressive, were mere background noise now. The pain they had caused her no longer had a hold. And as they continued to stumble through their own lives, struggling with their personal issues and lack of direction, Margaret had long since moved beyond them. Ethan, now alienated from his own mother, found himself grasping at straws, still trying to manipulate his way back into her good graces. He wanted her to bend again. Sophie, unable to find success in her own attempts to control others, continued to lash out. Their lives were filled with drama and self-doubt, while Margaret's life was filled with purpose and peace. And as Margaret continued to travel, teaching and mentoring, she saw the faces of the women she helped. They were strong, they were thriving, and they too would pass the lessons forward, creating a ripple effect that would last for generations. It was Margaret's legacy, and it was already changing the world. The woman who had once been silenced had become the voice for those who needed it most. Her journey, though far from over, had already made a mark, one that would last long after she had driven off into the horizon, ready for the next chapter of freedom. Margaret had never imagined that life after the courtroom would be this quiet. There were no more frantic calls from Ethan or Sophie, no more guilt-laden demands, no more manipulation or empty apologies. For the first time in years, she woke up each day with the calm assurance that her life was truly hers to live. It wasn't just the absence of their voices that had brought her peace. It was the sense of fulfillment that came from truly knowing she had fought for herself, for what she believed in. And she had won. Not just the battle for the RV, but the war for her autonomy. But life, as always, had a way of moving forward, and Margaret found herself with new challenges. The world had noticed her, her message, her story. The small workshops she had started with the RV had grown into something larger. Margaret had become a name in the world of women's empowerment, and now an opportunity had arisen that would take her to the next level. One bright morning, as Margaret sat sipping coffee at her desk, a letter arrived in the mail, an unexpected envelope with a seal that instantly caught her eye. It was an invitation to speak at the Global Women's Empowerment Conference, an event attended by some of the most influential women in the world. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. This was everything she had worked toward. The realization of her journey from a woman who had been silenced and manipulated to one who would now stand before a global audience and share her story. It was the pinnacle of what she had been trying to create. As she read the letter again, she smiled to herself. The invitation wasn't just an acknowledgement of her work. It was a sign that the world was ready to listen, ready to hear what she had to say. She wasn't just telling her story anymore. She was changing lives. But even as her professional world expanded, her focus remained centered on her personal life. She was careful not to lose sight of the people who mattered most, the friends who had stood by her when things were tough, the new friendships she'd forged with women who shared her journey, and, of course, Emma. Emma, now a teenager, had blossomed in ways Margaret never thought possible. The quiet, thoughtful girl she had once known had transformed into a confident young woman. There was a new respect between them, one rooted in shared understanding. Emma no longer saw her mother as someone who had been a victim. She saw Margaret as someone who had taken control of her life, who had chosen her own path, no matter the cost. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Emma had said one evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. "You've taught me that it's okay to stand up for yourself, to not let anyone walk all over you. I don't think I ever realized how strong you were." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. Emma was growing into her own person, a reflection of everything Margaret had fought for. She had done it, not just for herself, but for her daughter too. Emma's future would be different. She would never have to fight the same battles Margaret had. With Emma's pride and encouragement to sustain her, Margaret threw herself into her work. She began to travel even more frequently, her business expanding to offer more workshops and retreats. But each trip was purposeful. Every place she visited, every woman she mentored, added another layer to her growing sense of purpose. She was no longer just an advocate for women's empowerment. She was creating a lasting change, one life at a time. And yet, even as her life flourished, the shadows of the past remained. Robert, Sophie, and Ethan, though distant, still lingered in her mind from time to time. Margaret had long since stopped worrying about their petty attempts to regain control over her. They were irrelevant now, their voices fading as the noise of her own life grew louder. The peace Margaret had fought for was something they could never take from her again. She arrived at the conference, a sea of vibrant, powerful women, each one contributing their unique wisdom to the world. Standing before them, Margaret was struck by the realization that this was where she belonged. She had earned her place here, not through manipulation, not through appeasing anyone, but through the sheer force of her own will. As she took the stage, the room quieted. The weight of her presence felt before she even spoke. Margaret didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. The truth of her journey, the lessons learned, the pain overcome, and the strength she had cultivated, spoke for itself. She spoke to the women in the audience with the same calm strength she had learned to cultivate in herself, reminding them that their worth was not tied to anyone else's approval, that their power could never be stolen again. By the time she finished, the room was filled with applause, but it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the realization that she had become part of something far greater than herself. Her legacy, already solidified, would continue to inspire, continue to empower. Margaret had come full circle, not just in reclaiming her life, but in creating a ripple effect of strength and independence that would last for generations. As she left the stage, a familiar sense of peace settled over her. She had taught others what she had once had to learn the hard way. It wasn't just about survival, it was about living fully, unapologetically. She had fought for her right to exist on her own terms, and she had won. Now, with Emma by her side and the future wide open, Margaret could finally rest easy, knowing she had built something truly meaningful. This peace was hers, and no one could take it away. The invitations began to pour in after the conference, not just from local organizations or community leaders, but from prestigious institutions. Margaret found herself being recognized not just as a woman who had reclaimed her life, but as a powerful force for social change, a woman whose words resonated deeply with those who had been silenced for far too long. The first award arrived in the mail, a simple plaque that read, "Award for Excellence in Women's Empowerment and Advocacy." At first, it felt surreal, like a dream she had once had but never dared believe would come true. She held the plaque in her hands, running her fingers over the smooth surface. This was real. This recognition, this honor, was a result of years of her own personal transformation, of refusing to allow herself to be broken. Soon after, there were more awards: Best Advocate for Women's Rights, Social Justice Pioneer, and even an invitation to receive an honorary doctorate for her work in community leadership. With each award, Margaret felt the weight of her journey in a way she hadn't expected. These weren't just awards, they were affirmations of the woman she had become. And yet, as Margaret stood before crowds to accept each recognition, the voice that often echoed in her mind was her daughter's. Emma, now thriving in high school, had blossomed into a young woman who wasn't just proud of her mother but also fiercely independent in her own right. Emma had chosen a path of excellence herself, earning top grades, becoming involved in causes that spoke to her, and gaining entry into one of the best schools in the city. As Margaret watched her daughter navigate this new phase of life, she could see the subtle impact her own journey had had on Emma. One evening, as Margaret sat at the kitchen table, a handwritten note appeared in front of her, a small, simple gesture from Emma, who had a rare, quiet moment between her packed schedule. It read, "I'm so proud of you, Mom. You inspire me every day. Thank you for showing me what it means to stand up for myself." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. She had given her daughter the gift of independence, the freedom to be herself, to never apologize for her choices, and to find her own voice, even when the world tried to silence her. And Emma had taken that gift and run with it. But as Margaret celebrated these milestones, she couldn't escape the shadow of Robert, who, from a distance, watched her rise. After their separation, Robert had retreated into his own life, but the news of Margaret's newfound success reached him nonetheless. She had heard whispers of him, stories of his growing frustration and jealousy. His attempts to regain some control had failed miserably. He had tried to make inroads with Emma once or twice, but Emma wasn't interested in listening. She was proud of the mother who had shown her how to be strong, independent, and unafraid to stand up for what was right. From afar, Robert began to realize what he had lost. The woman he had tried to manipulate, control, and belittle was now more powerful than he could have ever imagined. Margaret had built a life that was her own, one that thrived without him. His guilt gnawed at him, but it wasn't guilt that drove him. It was fear. Fear of the ripple effect Margaret's strength had created in the family and in her own community. Margaret had become a force in the world of women's rights, especially in the area of custody battles. Her advocacy for mothers, for women who were denied a voice in family court, became one of her strongest focuses. She worked tirelessly with organizations to push for better treatment and respect for women in the courtroom, particularly in high-stakes custody battles where fathers with more power and resources often had the upper hand. Margaret became a symbol of what it meant to fight for a mother's right to be heard, for her ability to make decisions without judgment or ridicule. Her influence began to spread through policy change and public discussions. She was invited to speak at forums on women's rights and appeared on talk shows to discuss the pressing issues of child custody laws, offering legal advice and advocacy strategies. But it wasn't just about policy or courtroom victories. It was about the personal stories that fueled the work. Margaret connected with women one-on-one, offering legal counsel and emotional support. Every time she saw a mother regain her rights, a woman stand firm in her resolve, she knew the impact of her efforts would last far longer than any award could measure. Through it all, Margaret's relationships with her friends and business partners deepened. They admired her not just for her success, but for her authenticity. She was not just a figure of empowerment. She was someone who had lived through the struggle, who had overcome the hurdles. One evening, as Margaret reflected on her progress, she sat on the porch of her RV, the sun dipping below the horizon. Emma was upstairs, preparing for a school project. The house was quiet, the only sound the hum of the evening wind. Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath, savoring the calm that surrounded her. She had come so far from the woman who had been locked away in that RV, forced into isolation by the people who once claimed to love her. She had fought for herself. She had fought for Emma. And in the process, she had created a life that mattered, not just for her, but for so many others. The respect she had earned was not just from others, it was the respect she had learned to give herself. As she looked at the horizon, Margaret knew that her journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But she was no longer afraid. With Emma by her side and a world of possibilities ahead of her, Margaret had claimed the life she deserved. And nothing could take it away. Her legacy was more than the awards or accolades. It was the lives she had touched, the strength she had shared, and the women who would carry her lessons forward, generation after generation. Margaret had earned her peace, and that was the greatest victory of all. Margaret stood in the center of the bustling hall, her name now known across the country. What had started as a personal journey toward self-empowerment had transformed into something much larger, an unstoppable movement. Her foundation, born from the simple idea of supporting women who had faced the same struggles she once had, was now a national force, impacting thousands of lives. The walls of the conference room were adorned with photos of women who had reclaimed their voices, their independence, all because of the work Margaret had set in motion. The foundation had grown exponentially, hosting workshops, providing legal resources, and offering counseling for women in family court. Its mission, empowering women to fight for their rights, particularly in the courtroom, had reached all corners of the nation. What once seemed like a far-fetched dream was now a reality. Women who felt powerless, alone, or unheard were now finding their way, finding strength in themselves that Margaret had helped them unlock. She'd become a beacon, a guide for those lost in the storm, navigating the complexities of family law, societal expectations, and emotional manipulation. With every case she fought, every woman she mentored, her legacy grew stronger. But even as her influence grew, Margaret knew she couldn't take her eyes off the core of it all, those personal stories that fueled her work. As the head of the foundation, her role had evolved, but she remained deeply connected to the women she served. Every story she heard, every victory, reminded her of why she did it, why she had fought, not just for herself, but for every woman who had been made to feel small, less than, invisible. She often returned to the courtroom herself, not just as a figurehead or public speaker, but as an advocate, still fighting for women facing the same battle she had once fought with Ethan and Sophie. Her own courtroom stories, shared at conferences and workshops, resonated with many. Every woman who stood up in front of a judge, who faced opposition, who fought against the tide of their abusers, had her respect. Margaret was their voice, their ally, and their shield. As her foundation grew, so did her relationship with Emma. Emma, now an accomplished young woman in her own right, had become a rising star in the world of social justice. Her accomplishments were many. She had not only excelled in her studies, but had also been recognized for her contributions to various charitable causes, including those advocating for women and children in need. Her mother's legacy had not only inspired her, but it had shaped her life. Margaret was particularly proud of one moment, one that felt like the culmination of everything she had worked for. Emma had just been awarded a prestigious scholarship to a university that would allow her to pursue law, focused on family law, no less. "I want to make a difference, Mom. Just like you," Emma had said. her eyes shining with a quiet intensity that matched Margaret's own. Margaret's heart swelled with pride as she watched her daughter speak at a gathering of young women. Emma was becoming a leader, just as Margaret had hoped, and seeing her stand up so strong and confident was a reflection of everything Margaret had fought for. It was not just her own journey, but Emma's too. Emma was taking the lessons Margaret had learned the hard way and applying them to build something even greater. But with success came inevitable challenges. Margaret had long since closed the door on Ethan and Sophie. They had become irrelevant in her life, ghosts of a past that no longer held any power over her. However, she could feel the occasional ripple in the background, rumors, whispers, attempts at sabotage, but they no longer had any bearing on her. She was untouchable. Her legacy was too solid, too deeply ingrained in the lives of so many women for them to destroy. Then came the recognition, one final piece that would solidify her place in history. Margaret had been awarded the Humanitarian of the Year award. It was the kind of recognition that marked a lifetime of achievement, but Margaret took it in stride. It was nice, yes, but it wasn't about the awards anymore. It was about the work, the lives she'd changed, the women who stood tall because of her. Her efforts weren't just about putting a name on a plaque. They were about the conversations that happened in living rooms across the country, about the mothers and daughters who had seen what she had accomplished and believed they could do the same. She had built something lasting. Her foundation's influence was growing daily, and the future was wide open. She continued to mentor women, always listening, always advocating. Her efforts, however exhausting, would never stop. For as long as she could help one more woman take control of her life, one more person find their voice, Margaret would continue. But there was one final thought that Margaret held in her heart as she watched the foundation grow, as she reflected on all she had achieved. It wasn't just the good she had done, but the good she hadn't done. It wasn't about making Ethan and Sophie see her strength. It was about proving it to herself, showing herself she was enough without needing them to validate her. They tried to destroy everything I built. They never touched my legacy. Margaret had not only fought for her life, her daughter's life, but for the future of countless women who would never meet her face to face. Her legacy would endure long after she was gone, passed down in the whispers of those she had empowered to fight for their own peace, their own future. She had claimed it, and no one, not even her past, could take it away.